All right, so we want to check our work from yesterday. And so before we do that, we want to keep in mind what that end in mind is for this whole week of study. The skill that we're really trying to look at is identifying aspects of characters. And so our question yesterday, the one that goes with this end in mind, dealt with TJ. What did we learn about TJ through his actions, his thoughts, and his words? And we'll get to that in a moment. So, identifying aspects or identifying character traits. Our vocabulary is amiably, and that's kindly. Loitering is hanging around with no purpose. Dismissed is sent away. Collide is smashed together. Emitted is gave off or sent out. And I'll be honest, as much as I would love to be back in school right now, I do not miss the smells that are emitted from 11 and 12-year-old bodies right when they come in from recess in the spring. It's pretty strong. So emitted is gave off. That means you stink. Inaccessible is impossible to reach. Defiantly is with bold resistance, and tolerate is to put up with. Okay, so I think that Cassie is having to tolerate TJ's company as they're walking to school. You know, I don't think if she pitched a fit it would matter. So she's having to tolerate him at this point. I want us to look at our questions from yesterday. So our number one says, describe the setting of the story. And is it a violent place? And how can you tell? So you could take evidence from a variety of places. To describe the setting of the story, you could have said the South in the 1930s. You could say Mississippi. You could say that it's in America, but to me that's a little vague. The next part of the question says, is it a violent place? And the answer to that is yes, it is a violent place. And the evidence to that is on page 10. And I'm flicking through my book. And I would say that, yes, it is a violent place. And I know that because on page 10, it says, finally, TJ said, okay, see them berries burning? Wasn't no accident. Some white men took a match to them. So what TJ's telling his friend is that some white men set some black men on fire. Now, I don't know about you, but that's violent. To actually set someone on fire is a horrendous thing to do. And so that tells us that it's a very violent place. Question number 2. How does the author show that TJ looks out for only himself? Okay? So when I think about this, the author shows that TJ is only looking out for himself by how he lies to his mom to get out of trouble for being at that store. And he lies and says he had to go to rescue Claude because he knew the mom would not want him up there. Because he knew that he would get in a ton of trouble. So he lied to stay out of trouble. And on page 11 is where that comes from. So my evidence is on page 11 where it says, but don't worry, I got out of it. I just said old Claude was always sneaking up there to get some of that free candy. And I had to go and get him because I know good and well she didn't want us up there. And Mama about wore him out. And so when we think about that, it shows what kind of person he is. And if you even flip it on page 12, it said, Stacy, who generally overlooked TJ's underhanded stunts, shook his head. That was dirty. Well, what'd you expect me to do? I couldn't let her think I was going up there because I like to. she'd have killed me. So TJ is showing us that he's only looking out for number one. He didn't care about his little brother as long as he didn't get caught. And as you get older, you will probably run into one or two people like TJ in your lives who's really just looking out for number one and doesn't really care whoever else that he or she has to step on to make themselves look good, and or to stay out of trouble. They'll throw you under the bus. And TJ's one of those kind of people. Number 3, explain why Cassie and the other kids have to scramble up the bank. And on page 13 is where that comes from. So we would say Cassie and the other kids have to scramble up the bank because the bus load of white kids are trying to run them over and to cover them in dust. And so I know this because on page 13, it says, the bus had sped past, enveloping him in a scarlet haze, while laughing white faces pressed against the bus window. And we know this wasn't the first time that this bus did this. How do we know that? Yeah, we know it wasn't the first time because the older kids all knew to jump up that bank when they heard the bus coming. So for them to know to jump and get out of the way tells us that this was by no means the first occurrence. Little man, this was his first day at school. He didn't know what was going on. And he thought, I ain't getting dirty. You know, he wasn't scrambling up the side of this roadside and getting dirty. So we know this had been done more than once. Now, our last question is number 4. It says, compare Cassie's school with Jeremy's school. And there's a lot of ways that you could compare these two. And I've jotted down some ways. And evidence would be through pages 15 and 16. Okay? So anywhere on those 2 pages, you're going to find these things. And I've just kind of pinpointed some of these. So the ways that I would compare Cassie and Jeremy's school is that Cassie's school is much worse than Jeremy's school. Jeremy's school has a bus and Cassie's does not. Okay, Cassie has to walk. Jeremy's school is nicely painted, but Cassie's is not. Cassie's school is run down looking. Jeremy's school starts earlier in the year. Remember, he said his school started in August. But Cassie's school doesn't start until the kids are done working in the fields. Starts back in mid-October. So if I'm going to compare them, that's what I'm looking for, okay? You could have talked about how Jeremy's school had an athletic field, and it had stadium seating, and Cassie's did not. That would be another way that you could describe it. So when we're thinking about comparing, it's really talking about what one has, what the other one has, or what the other one does. So that's what we're talking about. Not necessarily a Venn diagram, the circles. A T-chart would have very well worked here for a graphic organizer, okay? So take a moment and kind of make your corrections there. I'm going to give you about a minute and a half. Just kind of jot down very roughly some things you might want to change. For those of you who aren't making any changes or adding anything to your answer, I have a question to ask, and I wrote it down here so I wouldn't forget it. Do you think it's right that Cassie and her friends have to go to a different school instead of the same one that Jeremy gets to go to? And I want you to think about why or why not. Do you think it's right that Cassie and her brothers and friends have to go to a different school instead of the same one that Jeremy gets to go to? So really what you're thinking is it fair that they're segregated? Is it fair that there is a black school and a white school? And then you have to answer, why do you think it's fair? Or why do you think it's fair? And that's a question, that's a personal question that for you to answer. You know, I think it's different for everyone. As an adult, I look at segregation as always being wrong. I think that everyone should always be treated as equals. So, you know, I instantly think that I think it's wrong. I think it's wrong that they were separated. I think it's wrong that there were two different schools and that one school had things that the other school did not have. And so I think it's a horrible thing. But what I will tell you is I grew up in Detroit until I was 10. And my brothers and I were part of a desegregation of schools in Detroit. And it was a huge deal at the time. And family names and things were put into a drawing, a lottery. And my brothers and I, we lived in Detroit, which was a very mix of races, religious and ethnicities. But the school we went to, even though there was a variety of cultures and colors there, it was a predominantly white school. And so when they decided to do a desegregation of schools, which means that they wanted to infuse white population of kids into what would normally be a predominantly African American school or a black school, they would take that same amount of students from that predominantly black or African American school and put them in a white or Caucasian school. We were part of the lottery that were bused, which was a very huge deal at the time as part of this desegregation aspect. My family was very worried. They were kind of, a little bewildered about how this took place. So I kind of have a firsthand knowledge of how that desegregation and worry works on families. So even though I'm saying they should be treated the same, I also realize that there is a process of that desegregation and a change in mindset that goes on. And so for the 1930s, it would have been wonderful for them all to be together and be harmonious. But the nation was not ready for that, sadly. And I was being desegregated in the 1970s. And our country was still not all the way ready for it even then. And so even though with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, I think it was, we're talking 110 years later, our country was still not fully segregated. We were still not fully one united force. And sadly enough, there are places today where we're still not. So that's just a thinking question. You know, how do you feel? And you're entitled to your feelings. We may not always agree with one another, but that doesn't mean that we should become violent with one another. We should be respectful of one another's feelings and thoughts. So, that being said, I want us to go to page 17. And I hate to sit down. I feel like I'm so far down. But I will tell you is that it's kind of hard to stand up. Y'all know in class I sit down. So here we go. Page 17. "Hey, Cassie," said Mary Lou Welliver, the principal's daughter, as she flounced by in a new yellow dress. "Hey, yourself," I said, scowling so ferociously that she kept on walking. I stared after her a moment, noting that she would have on a new dress. Certainly no one else did. Patches on faded pants and dresses abounded on boys and girls come so recently from the heat of the cotton fields. Girls stood awkwardly afraid to sit, and boys pulled restlessly at starched high-button collars. Those students fortunate enough to have shoes hopped from one pinched foot to the other. Tonight, the Sunday clothes would be wrapped in newspaper and hung for Sunday, and the shoes would be packed away to be brought out again, only when the weather turned so cold that bare feet could no longer traverse the frozen roads. But for today, we all suffered. On the far side of the lawn, I spied Mo Turner speeding down the 7th grade class building, toward the 7th grade class building, and wondered at his energy. Mo was one of Stacy's friends. He lived on the Montier plantation, a 3.5-hour walk from the school. All right, so think about that. Mo lived a 3.5-hour walk from the school. So every morning he got up and he walked 3.5 hours to school. After school, he walked 3.5 hours back home. So he's walking 7 hours a day trying to get an education. Is there anyone out there who today that I'm talking to would walk 7 hours to go to school? Most of you are going, heck no. But we live in a different time where we are so accustomed and spoiled in a lot of ways to have an easily accessible education. And we take it for granted. This young boy knew the value of education, and his family did. And so he was determined to get that any way he had to go. Let's get back in here. Because of the distance, many children from the Montier plantation did not come to Great Faith after they had finished the 4-year school near Smellings Creek. But there were some girls and boys like Mo who made the trek daily, leaving their homes while the sky was black and not returning until all was blackness again. I, for one, was certainly glad that I didn't live that far away. I don't think my feet would have wanted that badly for me to be educated. Well, the chiming of the second bell began, and I stood up, dusting my bottom as the 1st and 2nd, 3rd, and 4th graders crowded up the stairs into the hallway. Little man flashed proudly past, his face and hands clean and his black shoes shining again. I glanced down at my own shoes, powdered red, and raising my right foot, rubbed it against the back of my left leg, then reversed the procedure. As the last gong of the bell reverberated across the compound, I swooped up my pencils and notebook and ran inside. A hallway extended from the front to the back door of the building, and on either side of the hallway were 2 doorways, both leading into the same large room, which was divided into 2 classrooms by a heavy canvas curtain. The 2nd and 3rd graders were on the left, and the 1st and 4th grades on the right. And I hurried to the rear of the building, turning to the right and slid into a 3rd-row bench occupied by Gracie Pearson and Alma Scott. "You can't sit here," objected Gracie. "I'm saving it for Mary Lou." Well, I glanced back at Mary Lou Welliver, depositing her lunch pail on a shelf in the back of the room, and said, "Not anymore, you ain't." Miss Daisy Crocker, yellow and buck-eyed, glared down at me from the middle of the room with a look that said, "So, it's you, Cassie Logan?" Then she pursed her lips and drew the curtain along the rusted iron rod and tucked it into a wide loop in the back wall. With the curtain drawn back, the 1st graders gazed quizzically at us. Little man sat by a window, his hands folded, patiently waiting for Miss Crocker to speak. Mary Lou nudged me. "That's my seat, Cassie Logan." "Mary Lou Welliver," Miss Crocker called primly. "Have a seat." "Yes, ma'am," said Mary Lou, eyeing me with a look of pure hate before turning away. While Miss Crocker walked stiffly to her desk, which was set on a tiny platform and piled high with bulky objects covered by a tarpaulin, and she rapped the desk with a ruler, although the room was perfectly still, and said, "Welcome, children, to Great Faith Elementary School." And turning slightly so that she stared squarely at the left side of the room, she continued, "To all of our fourth graders, it's good to have you in my class. I'll be expecting many good and wonderful things from you." Then, addressing the right side of the room, she said, "And to all our little first grade friends, only today starting on the road to knowledge and education, may your tiny feet find the pathways of learning steady and forever before you." Already bored, I stretched my right arm on the desk and rested my head in my upraised hand. Miss Crocker smiled mechanically and then rapped on her desk again. "Now, little ones," she said, still talking to the first grade, "your teacher, Miss Davis, has been held up in Jackson for a few days, and I'll have the pleasure of sprinkling your little minds with the first rays of knowledge." She beamed down upon them as if she expected to be applauded for this bit of news. Then, with a swoop of her large eyes to include the fourth graders, she went on. "Now, since there's only one of me, we shall have to sacrifice for the next few days. We shall work, 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 but we shall have to work like little Christian boys and girls and share, share, share. Now, are we willing to do that?" "Yes, Miss Crocker," the children chorused, but I remained silent. I never did approve of group responses, and adjusting my head and my hand, I sighed heavily, my mind on the burnings of the berries. Now, I'm still thinking about Cassie. The majority of this reading is about our character Cassie. So if I want to identify an aspect of Cassie through her actions is really what I'm going to be thinking about at this point. I could say that Cassie is really someone who thinks for herself, just based on her response to Miss Crocker's responding or wanting the kids to respond all together. Where, it's like, "Yes, Miss Crocker." She says, "I always thought those group responses were stupid." So she's somebody who thinks for herself. Now, and I guess I think I'm a little bit like Cassie. I think those group things are kind of dumb. I mean, really and truly, what's it accomplishing? But she's a thinker. So, but anyway, "Cassie Logan?" Well, I looked up startled. "Cassie Logan." "Yes, ma'am." I jumped up quickly to face Miss Crocker. "Aren't you willing to work and share?" "Well, yes'm." "Then say so." "Yes'm," I murmured, sliding back into my seat as Mary Lou, Gracie, and Alma giggled. Here it was, only 5 minutes into the new school year, and already I was in trouble. Well, by 10 o'clock, Miss Crocker had rearranged our seating and written our names on her seating chart. I was still sitting beside Gracie and Alma, but we had been moved from the third to the first row in front of a small pot-bellied stove. Although being eyeball to eyeball with Miss Crocker was nothing to look forward to, the prospect of being warm once the cold weather set in was nothing to be sneezed at either. So I resolved to make the best of my rather dubious position. But now Miss Crocker made a startling announcement. This year we would all have books. Everyone gasped, for most of the students had never handled a book at all besides the family Bible. I admit that even I was somewhat excited. Although Mama had several books, I had never had one of my very own. Now, we're very fortunate to get these readers, Miss Crocker explained while we eagerly awaited the unveiling. The county superintendent of schools himself brought these books down for our use, and we must take extra good care of them. And she moved toward her desk. So let's all promise that we'll take the best care possible of these new books. She stared down, expecting our response. All right, all together, let's repeat. We promise to take good care of our new books. She looked sharply at me as she spoke. We promise to take good care of our new books. That's how I kind of imagine Cassie saying it. Fine, Miss Crocker beamed, then proudly threw back the tarpaulin. Well, sitting so close to the desk, I could see that the covers of the books, a motley red, were badly worn, and the gray edges of the book pages had been marred by pencils and crayons and ink. My anticipation at having my own book ebbed to a sinking disappointment. But Miss Crocker continued to beam as she called each fourth grader to her desk and recorded a number in her row book, handed him or her a book. As I returned from my trip to her desk, I noticed the first graders anxiously watching the disappearing pile. Miss Crocker must have noticed them too, for as I sat down, she said, Don't worry, little ones. There are plenty of readers for you too. See there on Miss Davis's desk? Wide eyes turned to the covered teacher's platform directly in front of them, and an audible sigh of relief swelled in the room. Well, I glanced across at Little Man, his face lit in eager excitement. I knew that he could not see the soiled covers or the marred pages from where he sat. And even though his penchant for cleanliness was often annoying, I did not like to think of his disappointment when he saw the books as they really were. But there was nothing that I could do about it, so I opened my book to its center. I began browsing through the spotted pages. Girls with blonde braids and boys with blue eyes stared up at me. And I found a story about a boy and his dog lost in a cave and began reading while Miss Crocker's voice droned on monotonously. Suddenly, I grew conscious of a break in that monotonous tone, and I looked up. Miss Crocker was sitting at Miss Davis's desk with the first grade books stacked before her, staring fiercely down at Little Man, who was pushing a book back upon the desk. What's that you said, Clarence Chester Logan? She asked. The room became gravely silent. Everyone knew that Little Man was in big trouble, for no one, but no one, ever called Little Man Clayton Chester, unless she or he meant serious business. Well, Little Man knew this too, and his lips parted slightly as he took his hand from the book, and he quivered. But he did not take his eyes from Miss Crocker. I said, may I have another book, please, ma'am, he squeaked. That one's dirty. Dirty? Miss Crocker echoed, appalled by such temerity. She stood up, gazing down upon Little Man like a bony giant. But Little Man raised his head and continued to look into her eyes. Dirty? And just who do you think you are, Clayton Chester? I hear the county's giving us these wonderful books during these hard times, and you're going to stand there and tell me that the book's too dirty? Now you take that book or get nothing at all. The Little Man lowered his eyes and said nothing as he stared at the book. And for several moments he stood there, his face barely visible above the desk. And then he turned and looked at the few remaining books, and seeming to realize that they were as badly soiled as the one Miss Crocker had given him, he looked across the room at me. I nodded, and Little Man glanced up again at Miss Crocker. And he slid the book from the edge of the desk, and with his back straight and his head up, returned to his seat. Well, Miss Crocker sat down again. Some people around here seem to be giving themselves airs. I'll tolerate no more of that, she scowled. Sharon Lake, come get your book. Well, I watched little man as he scooted into his seat beside two other little boys. And he sat for a while with a stony face, looking out the window. Then, evidently accepting the fact that the book in front of him was the best that he could expect, he turned and opened it. But as he stared at the book's inside cover, his face clouded, changing from sulky acceptance to puzzlement. His brows furrowed. Then his eyes grew wide, and suddenly he sucked in his breath and sprang from his chair like a wounded animal, flinging the book into the floor and stomping madly upon it. While Miss Crocker rushed to little man and grabbed him up in powerful hands, and she shook him vigorously, then set him on the floor again. Now just who's got what's gotten into you, Clayton Chester? But little man said nothing. He just stood staring down at that open book, a-shivering with indignant anger. Pick it up, she ordered. No, defied little man. No, I'll give you 10 seconds to pick up that book, or I'm going to get my switch. The little man bit his lower lip. I knew that he was not going to pick up that book. Well, rapidly, I turned to the inside cover of my own book and saw immediately what had made little man so furious. Stamped on the inside cover was a chart which read, and if you look on page 25, those of you who are just listening, pick your book up real quick and look at page 25. It's listed by chronological issuance. That means years, so years 1 through 12. And look at the race of the students. White, all the way down to year 12, and then it says Negro. Look at the condition of the book. It starts out new, excellent, excellent, very good, 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 average, 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 poor, poor, and very poor. So why do you think that Christopher John, a little man, is having such a hissy? Why is he acting the way he's acting? Okay, we're talking about his actions. Okay. He's acting this way because he realizes that they've given him the school of books when they're so old and wore out that they're not any good for the white kids anymore. And that they are calling him a Negro. And he finds that offensive, as he should, And so that's why he's acting the way he's acting. Let's turn to page 26. The black lines continue down to line 20, and I knew that they had all been reserved for black students. Well, a knot of anger swelled in my throat and held there. But as Miss Crocker directed the little man to bend over the whipping chair, I put aside my anger and I jumped up. Miss Crocker, don't, please, I cried. Miss Crocker, dark eyes warned me not to say another word. I know why you done it. You want part of this switch, Cassie? No, ma'am, I said hastily. I just want to tell you how come little man done what he done. Now, this is where we stop for today. And I'm writing that down. When we come back tomorrow, we'll be breaking down our questions and getting and finishing our reading, okay? So, that being said, I'll see you all tomorrow.